Silent Nights is a first-person horror game where you play as a concerned grandson visiting his widowed grandmother, but after finding she isn't home, they start to realize that something is wrong. The game is available on Steam. Atmosphere. The somber feeling of the early game and the sadness that follows in the wake of the opening cutscene passes quickly to the empty home. Its yellowed lights, wooden floors, and old furniture provide a feeling of nostalgia that's backed up by the slow and reflective piano music that haunts the early game. When the night comes around, the house feels more electric, and walking through the darkness to light the candles is really intense. But it sadly begins to decline quite quickly. The game's story itself tends to hurt the atmosphere at certain points, with there being a massive disconnect between the things the player character witnesses and the things he takes away from the situation. It really strains the suspension of disbelief, where it's hard to relate to the player character believing that the clearly supernatural things happening are still somehow his grandmother. The rift between player and player character keeps getting progressively worse as the game goes on, which only hurts the atmosphere more and more. It finally takes a huge hit in the latter parts of the game where you leave the house to explore the forest, and the pacing of the story is mixed in with some lackluster, unexplained, and seemingly unrelated scripted events and environments. And it leads the whole section to feel like it was a last-minute attempt to add in more horror, even if that horror didn't make a great deal of sense. The hut and the outbuilding you discover whilst walking in the forest have a bit of tension in them, but the game doesn't really use this for anything more than some jump scares, and suddenly they're over. The atmosphere starts off good, but gets steadily worse as the game goes on until the end, where there's just nothing left. That's no Harry Masons. Scares. The game uses mostly scripted events and jump scares sporadically throughout its short runtime, and it really struggles to execute them particularly well, with the scripted events simply waiting for you to look at them, which often means you'll find yourself awkwardly staring at a looping animation until you stand in the right position for it to do something and vanish. A lot of events also triggered when the camera was facing in the wrong direction, which just left the player with an audio cue and some confusion, since the camera locks you in place to view stuff. The game uses jump scares as well, and whilst they are effective at startling the player, most of them felt cheap in their execution, and again, the story doesn't really explain why any of this is happening, which leads to the feeling of being cheated into being scared. There's not much else but some unsettling events near the start of the game that were mildly disconcerting. That's still no Harry Masons. Sound design. The game's music is surprisingly good, with some really emotional piano music to allow the early game to feel more empathic towards the player character's grandmother. And even as the game moves into the disappointing latter parts, the game's soundtrack still delivers some spooky reverb-soaked drones, unsettling notes played on the cello that waver low in the mix, which is about the only thing reinforcing the atmosphere by the time you get to the forest. The jump scare noises are pretty unique in certain scenarios, though some didn't benefit the jump scares themselves, with things like a reversed piano note sounding great but pretty much destroying the anticipation to the jump scare. The sound effects were all stock, and whilst they mostly sounded fine and realistic in their environments, they aren't very unique, and I've ended up hearing identical ones in just this month. Though it's not a big complaint, it's just a bit unoriginal. The most disappointing part of the sound design was the directional audio and how it struggled to differentiate the floors of the house, with the volume staying the same no matter what floor you were on, meaning that even if the sound came from the right direction, which is something the game also struggled with, it could lead the player to check out the wrong floor entirely, which is only a problem since a lot of the game's progression is tied to finding notes that were indicated by audio cues. The sound design has several problems, with varying severity, and whilst it did some things quite well and generally works, it causes problems in different places. That's still no Harry Masons. Gore. There's a bit of blood in the game and it's pretty realistic, seeing it soaked into the wooden floorboards of the hut in the forest, and there's sprays of it and human-like remains in the outbuilding. But as for why it's there, it's one of the few things in the game that sort of explains itself with a single note mentioning a killer, which is a bit of a weak connection, but it's the most danger the game really comes close to. That's one Harry Mason. Story. The opening cutscene explains that the player character's grandfather died 2 years ago, and his grandmother, who lives alone, has been understandably sad and lonely, so the player character is going to visit her. The story makes sense for a little while, and some of the notes, whilst not written particularly well, still get the point across. But sadly, and bit by bit, the game starts to make less sense, with some very obviously supernatural events being followed by the player character assuming it's still somehow their grandmother. This, combined with how many legitimate supernatural things they see that they just ignore, creates a huge disparity between the player and the player character that hurts nearly every aspect of the game. The latter half is somehow even worse, with it introducing a lot of things that it doesn't follow up on before the game's ending, which is extremely disappointing, as even the cliche finale that it feels like the game is steering towards is subverted into a blunt and abrupt wrap-up that leaves all of the ghostly events simply not explained. There's no growth or evolution of anything that happens in the story, and it feels like it's possible it could have suffered from translation errors, but mostly feels like it was edited for brevity or just not very well written to begin with. As a game that's made of a series of linear events that are supposed to tell a story, it's extremely disappointing to see the story is probably its weakest part, making the final score 1 out of 5 Harry Masons. The game feels like someone's first project, and that very well may be the case. It's not like the game didn't have any strengths at all, and the early game started off pretty strong, but it's a good example of how something that like a poorly written story can hurt a game that relies so heavily on scripted linear events. If the game had taken care with the writing and developed a compelling story that led to something greater, or even just explained the events that took place, then the things like the atmosphere could have been radically improved. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't like this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I found my grandmother, I try not to figure things out and advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace.